stopped scrolling, because the moment my HOA Karen leaned over my fence, snapped photos of my garden and whispered weeds into her phone. My quiet suburban life detonated into a full-blown neighborhood war that ended in judges, ribbons, and karma no one saw coming. I'm not exaggerating when I say this single report almost cost me my home, my savings, and my sanity, all because one woman couldn't stand seeing wildflowers where she expected boring green grass. It started on a Tuesday morning, the kind that feels harmless until it isn't. I was watering my garden, watching monarchs flutter between milkweed, when I felt eyes on me. Across the hedge stood Karen, clipboard tucked under her arm, lips tight, sunglasses oversized like armor. She didn't say hello. She didn't smile. She just frowned at the flowers, shook her head, and walked away while tapping furiously on her phone. That was the first warning shot. By Friday, the official notice arrived. Violation, uncontrolled weeds, and unsightly growth. A fine. A deadline. A threat of further action. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking, because this garden wasn't neglect. It was intentional. Every plant had a purpose. Every patch of mess was life. Bees, butterflies, birds. I had spent years building it, guided by conservation manuals and local experts, never imagining it would be labeled a nuisance. When I confronted Karen, she smiled like she'd already won. She told me rules were rules, that personal opinions didn't matter, and that neighborhoods needed order. As she spoke, a swallowtail landed on a purple coneflower between us, wings open like a challenge. She swatted the air and stepped back, disgusted. In that moment, something hardened inside me. That night I walked the garden slowly, listening to crickets and watching moths rise like sparks from the soil. I realized how fragile this space was. Not because nature was weak, but because power often ignores understanding. The HOA letter sat on my kitchen table like a ticking clock. I could rip everything out and surrender, or I could prepare for a fight I never asked for. What Karen didn't know, what no one in that HOA knew, was that this weed patch was already on the radar of people who mattered far more than her clipboard. I realized this wasn't just about a garden. It was about who gets to decide what belongs, what's beautiful, and what deserves to live. Karen had escalated this to the HOA, so I decided to escalate it to the truth, no matter how loud, public, or uncomfortable it became. What followed pulled neighbors, inspectors, experts, and cameras into my yard, transforming a private dispute into a public reckoning that would permanently change Karen's smug certainty and her perfect image. The next morning, I didn't pull out a single plant. Instead, I opened a folder I hadn't touched in months, the one labeled Pollinator Project. Inside were certificates, emails, diagrams, and photographs documenting every step of my garden's evolution. Karen thought she'd caught me off guard. What she didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for this fight long before she ever learned my name. I started making calls. The local Native Plant Society answered first, their director immediately recognizing my address. Apparently, my garden had been featured in a small newsletter the previous year. Then I contacted the county environmental office, the same one that had approved my habitat registration. By noon, my panic had shifted into something sharper. Focus. This wasn't rebellion. This was compliance at a level Karen couldn't even spell. That afternoon, Karen returned. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 HOA board members followed her, scanning my yard like crime scene investigators. Karen narrated loudly, pointing at milkweed, goldenrod, and coneflowers as if listing offenses. Overgrown, invasive, unmaintained, she said, savoring each word. One board member nodded, already convinced. The other hesitated, squinting at a butterfly resting on a leaf. I handed them the folder. At first they waved it off, but when I calmly said, "This garden is officially registered as a certified butterfly sanctuary," their expressions shifted. Papers were flipped. Emails read. Karen's voice faltered. She laughed awkwardly and said certifications didn't override HOA rules. That's when I told her the county thought differently. Word spread fast. Neighbors who'd quietly admired the garden for years started stopping by, curious about the commotion. A retired teacher mentioned how her grandkids loved counting butterflies here. A young couple said the garden inspired them to plant native flowers. Each comment chipped away at Karen's narrative of community standards. Still, the HOA wasn't backing down. A formal hearing was scheduled, 7 days. Karen strutted away that evening, confident again, telling anyone within earshot that I'd be forced to clean up that mess. But behind her confidence was something new. Uncertainty. Because she'd expected embarrassment and retreat, not documentation and support. That night, I prepared like it was a trial. I printed photos showing seasonal changes, lists of species supported, letters from conservation groups. I even had a statement from a local university entomologist praising the garden's impact. Each page felt like armor. As I worked, I realized something unsettling. Karen had never once asked what the garden was for. She'd never listened. She'd only judged. And now, her rush to control had put her directly in the path of people who cared deeply about what she wanted destroyed. The hearing wouldn't just decide the fate of my garden. It would expose whether the HOA valued image over impact, rules over reason. And Karen was about to learn that not everything wild is wrong, and not everything orderly is right. The HOA hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and by the time I arrived, the room was already buzzing. Folding chairs filled quickly, neighbors whispering, phones out, curiosity thick in the air. Karen sat front and center, arms crossed, chin raised, wearing that tight smile people use when they're certain the rules are on their side. She didn't look at me once. She didn't need to. She believed this was already over. The HOA president opened the meeting, outlining the complaint in a flat voice. Unapproved landscaping, excessive weeds, violation of community aesthetic standards. Each phrase felt deliberately vague, as if nature itself were on trial. Karen was invited to speak first. She stood confidently, clicking through photos she'd taken from my fence line, close-ups, chosen to look chaotic. She talked about property values, about order, about how personal projects shouldn't affect everyone else. A few heads nodded. For a moment, doubt crept in. Then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply placed my materials on the table and began telling the story of the garden, how it started, with one milkweed plant after I learned monarch. Populations were collapsing, how each year I added natives, not randomly but intentionally. I explained the certifications, the county registration, the species supported. I showed photos Karen didn't, wide shots alive with color, butterflies mid-flight, children from the neighborhood crouched in wonder. The mood shifted. One board member leaned forward. Another asked questions. When I read a short letter from the university, entomologist calling the garden a model for suburban conservation, there was an audible murmur. Karen interrupted, insisting that rules were rules. That's when the county environmental officer, who had come on their own time, stood up. They explained that certified habitats were protected, that HOAs could not penalize homeowners for environmentally approved conservation efforts. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Karen's smile vanished. She looked around, searching for support, but found only curiosity and discomfort. Then something unexpected happened. Neighbors spoke, one by one. A veteran talked about how the garden calmed him. A mother described teaching her kids about ecosystems there. Even the hesitant board member admitted he'd learned more in 20 minutes than in years on the HOA. By the end, this wasn't about weeds anymore. It was about pride, progress, and whether fear of difference should outweigh measurable good. The board called for a short recess. Karen stormed out, heels clicking sharply, certainty cracking with every step. When they returned, the decision was unanimous. The violation was dismissed, the fine revoked, and the garden was officially recognized as a community asset. But what happened next, what Karen did afterward, turned victory into something far more satisfying and far more public. I thought the story would end with the ruling, a quiet victory, and a humbled Karen retreating into silence. I was wrong. Because losing didn't teach Karen reflection. It taught her resentment. And resentment, when mixed with embarrassment, tends to look for revenge. The very next week, anonymous complaints began appearing online. Someone claimed my garden attracted pests. Another said it caused allergies. A third warned it was a safety hazard. None had names, but everyone knew the handwriting. Karen started avoiding eye contact, yet somehow always appeared nearby when inspectors stopped by. She never spoke, just watched, arms folded, waiting for something, anything, to stick. But the opposite happened. The county inspectors didn't find violations. They found excellence. They photographed species, measured coverage, and asked permission to use my garden as a reference site. One of them mentioned an upcoming regional pollinator competition I'd never heard of. Apparently, my habitat already met most criteria. All it needed was formal submission. News traveled fast. A local reporter reached out after hearing about the HOA garden dispute. The article didn't paint me as rebellious. It painted the garden as a lifeline in concrete suburbia. Photos ran online, monarchs, swallowtails, bees dusted with pollen. The headline used the word sanctuary. Karen lost control of the narrative completely. At the next HOA meeting, the board announced new guidelines encouraging native planting. Applause broke out. Karen sat frozen. Her authority, once enforced with fines and whispers, had evaporated. The community she claimed to protect had chosen something she tried to erase. Then came the competition results. On a Saturday morning, a small crowd gathered in my yard as an official handed me a ribbon and certificate. Outstanding contribution to urban butterfly conservation. First place. Cameras clicked. Neighbors cheered. Someone popped open sparkling cider. Karen watched from her driveway, face pale, realization finally landing. By trying to destroy the garden, she had amplified it. I didn't gloat. I didn't speak her name. I thanked the community, the experts, and the insects themselves. But when a child tugged her parent's sleeve and said, "That's the lady who said the butterflies were weeds," Karen turned and went inside. That afternoon, something changed. The garden no longer felt like mine alone. It belonged to the neighborhood, to the children counting wings, to the quiet people who needed proof that doing the right thing could still win. And Karen? She stopped patrolling, stopped reporting, powerless without fear to fuel her. But the final moment, the one that truly closed this chapter, came weeks later, in the most unexpected way. Weeks passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. The garden grew thicker, louder, more alive than ever, as if it sensed the safety it had earned. Butterflies returned in waves, monarchs drifting like orange confetti, swallowtails flashing blue and gold. Neighbors no longer whispered when they walked by. They waved. They stopped. They asked questions. What began as defiance had become education. Then one afternoon a letter appeared in my mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA. It wasn't from the county. It was handwritten, the envelope plain, the return address unmistakable. Karen. I stood there longer than I should have, debating whether to open it. Part of me expected another complaint, another attempt to regain control. But inside was something different. The handwriting was stiff, careful, like someone unused to admitting fault. She wrote that she hadn't understood. That she grew up believing tidy meant good, wild meant careless. That losing the hearing, then seeing the article, the ribbon, the neighbors' reactions, it forced her to confront how wrong she'd been. She admitted fear played a role. Fear of change. Fear of standing out. Fear of being ignored in a world moving faster than her rules. The letter ended without an apology, but it didn't need one. The silence between the lines said enough. A few days later, I saw her again for the first time in weeks. She stood at the edge of the garden, not judging, not documenting, just watching. A monarch landed near her shoe. She didn't swat. She smiled, small, uncertain, but real. Then she nodded at me and walked away. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a story about an HOA Karen losing. It was about perspective winning. About how power backed by ignorance crumbles when faced with truth, patience, and proof. The HOA updated their handbook later that year. Native gardens were not only allowed, they were encouraged. 2 neighbors started their own. One planted milkweed. Another built a small pollinator patch by the mailbox. The neighborhood changed, quietly, permanently. And every time someone asks why I didn't just give in at the start, I look at the garden and answer honestly. Because some things are worth defending, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. Karen wanted weeds gone. What she got was transformation. Not just of a yard, but of a mindset, a community, and a story that reminds us that doing the right thing doesn't always look neat, but it always leaves something beautiful behind. If you've ever been told to shrink, to conform, to erase what makes something alive, remember this. Sometimes standing your ground doesn't just save what you love, it teaches others how to see. If you felt the heat of this story, hit like, because real victories start when we stand together. Subscribe to Karen's Story Hub to follow every jaw-dropping moment from my Karen files. And tell me below, how would you handle a Karen trying to control your life?